Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are in a series about family called Atypical that we started last week. Now, atypical means uncommon or not normal. In this series, we are talking about some not so normal families in the Bible and our own not so normal families as well. Now, why are we even talking about this? Why is this so significant? Because when it comes to our families, who says what typical really is, right? Sometimes we let other people's definitions or views of what's normal shape our view of our own families. But like we said last week, no matter what kind of family you come from, no family is typical. There's no normal family. But that's the point. You see, your family is already atypical. But what if God is calling your family to be even more atypical, more uncommon, more not normal than it already is? You see, every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles, right? But typical families either try to handle them on their own or never handle them at all. Now, atypical families, on the other hand, invite God into their imperfections, problems, and struggles. Last week, we said that there is no family too simple or too complex for God to use. Your family can be used by God to do atypical things in this world. But here's the important question that you may be asking. How, right? Like, God, how are you going to do that? How can you use my imperfect family? That's what I want to talk to you about tonight. You see, if you were with us last week, I shared a little bit about growing up with a stepdad and how our relationship was pretty rocky. Now, what I didn't mention was that I believe one of the main reasons that it was rocky, it was because he was not a follower of Jesus. You see, it was just me and my mom who were following Jesus at the time. And so when it came to faith, he would bump heads with me and my mom a lot. When it came to Christianity, when it came to our personal walk with Jesus. You see, we just saw life differently. And because of that, we had a lot of problems and conflicts when I was growing up. Now, I remember my mom praying for my dad for years for God to change his life. I remember her praying all through middle school and all through high school and even through college. And the reality is she probably started way before that. And when I became a follower of Jesus in high school, I joined my mom in praying for him too. Now, it wasn't until I graduated college and out of the house and I was already in my career and doing ministry that my dad actually surrendered his life to God. And the cool thing is that now my dad and mom go to church together and he's actually serving in church. He's one of the cameramen at the church that he goes to. Now, I truly believe it was because my mom and I, and mostly my mom, started praying for him a long time ago. So why do I even share that? At some point, every family experiences difficulty and conflict, right? You might be experiencing one of those situations right now. Now, typical families might try to handle those situations on their own or just ignore the problem and hope they go away. Now, honestly, that's what most families do, even Christian families. But what we're talking about, atypical families know that they can't handle their own problems on their own. Atypical families ask for God's help. Now, last week, we met the family of Adam and Eve, the world's very first family. And we saw how their story went very wrong as a result of their choices to disobey God and hurt each other. But through God's grace, we saw that God was still able to use that first family. So today, I want to introduce you to another family in Scripture. Now, this family lived many generations after Adam and Eve, and they were atypical in their own ways. Now, you may have heard about Abraham before. He's an important person in the history of the Christian faith because of an important promise that God made him a long time ago in the Old Testament. So, let's learn about Abraham's life, specifically his relationship with his nephew, Lot. So if you have a Bible, would you turn with me to Genesis chapter 13, and we're going to read verses 1 through 13 to get the context of where we're going, all right? So Genesis chapter 13 says this, starting at verse 1. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Now Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There, Abraham called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, his nephew, who was moving about with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling, I want you to remember that, and quarreling arose between Abraham's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abraham said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company." So their arguing got so bad that Abraham said, "Look, we gotta move. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'm gonna go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men, Abraham and Lot, remember they were family members, they parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom and Gomorrah. Last verse, verse 13. And I want you to remember this part because it's important to our story. Now the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Now, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were so bad that God had to do something, that God stepped in, and we're going to check what that looked like. But I want you to know that that's where Lot lived. Lot lived next to this crazy town with these crazy people. Now, Abraham and Lot were like many of our families today. They fought. And in fact, they fought so much that if they continued to live near each other, they probably would have hated each other. So Abraham and Lot moved to completely different cities. Now, imagine you had a fight so bad with a sibling or a parent or a cousin that you guys had to leave the same city you were living in and go to completely different cities. Like, that's how bad this got. So, what does this have to do with us? Let's pick up in the story in Genesis chapter 18, and we're going to read a few verses there. Genesis 18, chapter 18, verses 1 and 2 is where we pick up in our story. So it says this, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Verse 2, now Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. And when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. So here in the story, it says that God showed up in Abraham's life, Now, we don't know really what that looks like. It says there was 3 men that God was using, that God was speaking through. These men could have been angels, they could have been regular men. We don't know, but God was using these 3 men to speak to Abraham. So skip down to verse 16, same chapter. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" God was getting ready to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because they were so bad. Skipping down to verse 20, and it says this. It says, "Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." Then the men turned away and went towards Sodom and Gomorrah to destroy it. But Abraham remained standing before the Lord. And check out this conversation that Abraham had with God. Then Abraham approached God and said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" So Abraham now is pleading with God and says, "Look, you're going to destroy this city, but what if there's some good people in this city? What if there's some righteous people in this city? Will you spare the city for just 50 righteous people?" So verse 26 says this, "The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then Abraham spoke again, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, but what if the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there," he said, "I will not destroy it." Once again, Abraham spoke up, "What if only 40 are found there?" He said, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." God was speaking. Verse 30, then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak again. What if only 30 can be found?" God answered, "I will not destroy it if I find 30 there." Abraham said, "Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found there?" He said, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." Then he said, "May the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there?" God answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left and Abraham returned home. Last 2 verses, check this out. Chapter 19, verse 27 says this, "Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace." God destroyed the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. But check this last verse out. "So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham." He remembered the conversation that he had with Abraham, and he brought Lot, his nephew, out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived. So check this out. Abraham and Lot had a long history of disagreements, right? Remember, they fought so much that they had to move to different cities. But when Abraham learned that God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, the city where Lot lived, Abraham made a choice. He pleaded with God on Lot's behalf. And in response to Abraham's prayer, Lot and his family, and only Lot and his family, were saved. Last week, we said, if you want God to use your family to do atypical things, things that are uncommon, things that are not normal, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. And that's what Abraham did. When you're fighting with someone in your family, listen, it isn't typical to do what Abraham did. Because the typical response that most of us do, if not all of us do, when we get into an argument with a sibling or a parent or a neighbor, listen, it's to fight back, right? It's to hold a grudge. It's to give them the silent treatment. Listen, that's what I do a lot. But Abraham chose to do the atypical thing. He prayed for Lot in the middle of their conflict. He didn't wait for an apology. Listen, he reached out first in prayer. This might seem so simple, but it's so atypical. It's not the common thing that we do, right? It's not the normal thing to do to pray for the person that we're in conflict with. So here's the bottom line for tonight. This is what I want you to remember as we finish this video tonight, as you go on your week. Listen, not so typical families pray for each other. That's the point tonight. That's the bottom line. Atypical families pray for each other. And throughout Scripture, we see God teaches us that prayer has the potential to change everything. Now, just like Abraham saw prayer change his family for the better, and how I saw prayer change my family for the better, I believe that prayer can change your family for the better too. Every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles, right? But atypical families invite God into those situations through prayer. Prayer doesn't have to be complicated. It could be as simple as this. It could be as simple as thanking God for your family. Even if you're not sure you mean it at the moment. Listen, there's been so many times where I prayed for a family member and I didn't want to. But when you pray for someone, it changes your heart towards them. How about this? How about asking God to give you love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control? How about this? How about asking God to give you wisdom to resolve your disagreement? Or asking God to do the same thing for that family member that you're fighting with? Or how about thanking God for helping your family? So here's the challenge. Think right now about a recent disagreement you've had with a family member, or maybe a disagreement you seem to have often. Now imagine how that conflict could be transformed if you stopped to pray instead of fight. How do you think prayer could change your attitude, your temper, or your perspective? Like, how do you think prayer could change the person you're fighting with? How do you think prayer could begin to change your family's pattern of behavior for the long term? So as we get ready to close, I want to give you an action step. I believe that your response, or our response, should be this: you first. I want you to remember that action step this week. You first. What do I mean by that? It's interesting that Abraham chose to pray for Lot way before they even reconciled. In the middle of their conflict, Abraham went first by choosing to pray for Lot instead of continuing to fight with his nephew. So this week, what if you decided to go first? When disagreements happen, typical families do what? Right? They scream, they fight, they hold grudges, and they struggle to find common ground. But not so typical families pray for each other. So as we get ready to land the plane, as we get ready to close, what would it look like if you commit to praying for your family more than you fight with them? Imagine how God might be able to use your family to do atypical things in this world if you choose to pray instead of fight. So I want to give you a closing challenge. And actually, it's a prayer challenge. I want you to write the name of one family member you want to commit to praying for this week. Then jot down a few things. Like if you have a journal, I want you to maybe thank God or ask God for something on their behalf. And my hope is that by you praying first for them, that life change can begin to happen in your family. And like in my family, like in my dad's life, you can begin to see miracles. And listen, my mom and I were praying for, 15, 20 years before my dad's life changed. And I believe the same thing can happen in your family's life. And I'm believing that with you this week. So would you take that prayer challenge with me? Thanks for tuning in this week. Love you, and we're praying for you. Can't wait to see you next week. God bless.